Good morning, everyone. We are here with the second webinar in our specific, with a specific focus on operational risk and resilience. Obviously, after the last webinar we had, there's an important industry event, and that is the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has issued their guidance note for consultation on operational resilience. And in this follow-up webinar, we thought that would be a important topic from the industry perspective for us to cover. And obviously, as all of us know, it's still in consultative stage, and expected consultation is expected to close in November. So the range of perspective questions are emerging in industry from the interpretation and implementation point of view. So to address that, we have got a very distinguished panel. Some of you who were part of the earlier webinar are familiar with, but I would like to take an opportunity and introduce the panelists today. So starting from me, I'm Alok, co-founder of FTBA and Cognext, a leading global consulting analytics firm. With us today, our first panelist, Andrew Sheen, who are in the operational risk space. Andrew doesn't need any introduction, but for the purpose of the rituals, I'll quickly introduce Andrew. So Andrew has been best known for his work with FSA and PRA, the UK regulators. He's led some of the industry's most transformational supervisory uh, initiative in the area of operational risk. And Andrew has also been the member of BCBS OR working group. So we thought there is no one better than Andrew to take us through the interpretation and the application of the current guidance note. Subsequent to his role as a regulator for many years, Andrew worked in industry and again held senior leadership roles with global banks such as HSBC and Credit Suisse, leading the operational risk practices and implementation. We have got then Dr. David Goodyear. So David brings a very unique experience and perspective because he's worked both in the first line on the business side and as well as held the roles from operation and risk point of view. So he's got a very unique blend of perspective, both from the business frontline perspective as well as from the risk and operational risk second line perspective. And Dr. Jimi, again, regulator and then moved to the industry. So Jimi has spent close to 25 years in the industry, having seen it from both the side of the table. So Jimi currently works and advises some of the leading banks in Europe on their operational risk and resilience transformation. So I welcome all the panelists today for this session. And what we plan to cover today specifically, 4 items, starting with the overview of BCBS consultative papers and also the additional guidance on the BCBS principle for operational risk. So these topics will be covered in detail, and we'll share the industry perspective, what we hear and where banks see the implementation challenges. We'll also try and cover these from the more conceptual and design point of view, sharing the insights. And then we move to the topic that in terms of the bank, how they're approaching it and how they're looking to build operational risk framework. And towards the end, we plan to keep around 20 odd minutes for panel discussion and audience Q&A, so participants Q&A. And so that's the agenda for today. The first session will be taken by Andrew. So Andrew, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Alok, and thanks very much to Activa for this opportunity. I'm going to mention a couple of BAL committee papers that came out in consultation form in August. And the first one that I'm going to deal with is the principles for operational resilience. And you will, those who were kind enough to join us, excuse me, for the previous session, will remember there we talked about the PRA, and the PRA were first off the block with their paper. But actually, if you're coming new to this, the best approach would be to start with the BAL committee's paper. It's at a higher level. The PRA paper is more granular. And so the BAL committee paper is certainly an excellent introduction. And the purpose, as we show on the next slide, is to strengthen banks' ability to absorb operational risk-related events. And these are events that could cause significant operational failures or wide-scale disruptions in the market. And a key thing in all of this, and it'll come up time after time, is this paper recognizes that you can't prevent these potential hazards. So, for example, you cannot prevent your organization being subject to a cyber attack. You can do things in order to prevent them having an impact. But these issues, you know, nobody controlled the current pandemic. That was outside of every financial organization's control. So these events, these hazards can't be prevented. It's how you deal with them when they arise. And the paper recognizes that this is really about the ability to withstand. So the event happens, how do you withstand it? What do you do to respond to it and to recover and thereby mitigate any severe impacts? And if we move on to the next slide, there's one of the important things, and this is a consistent theme between the BAL paper and the papers produced by other regulators, and it is that operational resilience is an outcome. And if you think of operational risk in terms of the operational risk bow tie, where on the left-hand side of the bow tie you have causes, in the middle you have a single event, and then on the right-hand side you have the various impacts. Operational resilience is an outcome, and so it's an impact. It's an impact of COVID-19, it's an impact of a cyber attack, it's the impact of a loss of systems. And activities such as risk identification and assessment and risk mitigation, and again, if you go back to the risk cycle, these are all parts of the risk cycle. They're all activities that are required in order to try and manage operational resilience. And the interesting thing for me is that the paper carries what I think we all inherently know to be true, and actually we've seen during the COVID crisis is operational resilient banks do better if they have these events. And so it's important for banks to make sure that they are resilient. You can't control these events happening, so it's how you deal with them. And a resilient bank will lessen the impact of these events on their critical operations, their services, their functions. And so if we move on to the next slide, we can see that the BAL committee has defined operational resilience as the ability of a bank to deliver critical operations through disruption. Let's just take a step back there. It's talking about banks, but that's because it's the BAL Committee of Banking Supervisors. But that doesn't mean that what they're saying can't be applied to other institutions, financial institutions, even if they're not subject to the BAL Committee rules and guidance. But also institutions out there that may not even be in the financial arena. Now, one of the interesting differences between the PRA's paper and the BAL Committee's paper, the PRA's paper talks about important business services, but you identify your important business services in order to understand critical operations. The BAL Committee goes straight to this issue of critical operations. It's around the critical operations that you need in order to continue to run as an organization. and how you deliver those through disruption. And so those operations include activities, processes, services, and supporting assets. And by managing its resilience, as we saw on the earlier slide, it enables banks to protect themselves from threats and potential failures, and it's how they respond and adapt that's the key thing. Now, the Basel Committee has published 7 principles. The lovely thing about Basel Committee papers is that they tend to be principle based. And if you look at the paper, obviously it will give you more detail on the various principles, but it will also have some supporting paragraphs which underline how firms should deal with operational resilience. And the first 2 principles, I have to say, I was really pleased to read because they're saying a couple of things. One is on governance. Utilize your existing governance structure. Don't go off and build a new governance framework for operational resilience. You already have risk committees, risk management committees, board risk committees. Utilize that existing governance structure, and also leverage your operational risk management functions to identify and go through this resilience process. So again, don't go off and build a brand new risk management function, but leverage off what you already do. And those who joined us on the previous event will remember that we had their details of a number of activities that are already being undertaken as part of business as usual, which are relevant to operational resilience. Now, the principles go on, and of course, banks should have business continuity plans and conduct exercises. And these exercises are quite crucial. I remember when I was working in a firm, sometimes they seemed a bit of a nuisance. They were always at weekends. And so it always seemed a shame having to give up your weekend. But I think we've seen, for anyone who wasn't convinced, we've seen this year the value of having tested your continuity plans. The other thing you have to do, and here we're seeing parallels with the PRA paper, is map your internal and external connections and your interdependencies so that you understand what you need in order to deliver your critical operations. Now, as part of that process, you really need to understand your third parties and your intergroup entities. So most organizations these days have relationships, either they may be an entity, they have relationship with the group or other group entities. They may have relationships with third parties. Their third parties may have relationships with other parties. And you need to understand those dependencies in order to manage your critical operations. The 6th principle is that you develop and implement response and recovery plans to manage these incidents. And that's really important, that you've rehearsed these, that you've gone through it. People understand what their roles are in the incident management. You know, what information are you publishing? How are you communicating with your customers, your staff, regulators, and other key stakeholders? And then finally, the final principle is that you have resilient information and communications technology, and that covers cyber security. Now, we mentioned at the beginning, and if we move on to the next slide, we mentioned a second paper that was produced by the Basel Committee, and it was published at the same time, and it's a paper that's quite near to my heart. It was first published in February 2003, and it was updated in 2011, and I was lucky enough to be part of the group that was drafting that 2011 edition. And in 2014, the Basel Committee reviewed implementation of the principles with 60 systemically important banks by 60 systemically important banks in 20 jurisdictions. And so as a result of the changes that have taken place since the 2011 draft, and as a result of the findings of the 2014 review, the committee felt that it was the appropriate moment to revisit these principles. And if you look at the principles, you'll actually see, although I'll talk a little bit more in a second about this, that most of the principles haven't really changed. Some of the supporting paragraphs have changed. I think the big change is the introduction of an additional principle, and it's principle 10 in the new document. And it's about having robust information and communication technology governance. And if you remember back to the Op Resilience paper, the 7th principle was around information and communication technology. Now, that's not the only key change. There are a couple of changes. For example, principle 3, previously, when we published in 2011, firms were still developing their op risk frameworks. And so we had in there a principle about boards having responsibility for establishing, approving and reviewing the framework. That has now gone, and it's been replaced by a requirement on the board to oversee material operational risks and the effectiveness of key controls. And also principle 7 has changed. When we wrote principle 7, we talked about new products and activities, whereas now principle 7 requires senior management to assess the overall change management process. So there are some changes in this document. This document is very important because it is the foundation on which firms should build their operational resilience frameworks. So it's important that you read the two documents together. If you feel that you want to make a comment, you need to motivate or move quite quickly, because I think the consultation responses are due in on the 7th of November. And I'm sure the BAL committee will be very interested to see what sort of response. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. I'll pass over to Jimi.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. And firstly, just like to say thanks very much to Alok for that introduction, and to Aptiva for hosting this webinar, and especially for inviting us back again to do another webinar on this topic, which I think continues to be the hottest topic at the moment in operational risk. And I say that because we certainly have heard in talking to some firms, and I'm sure you will have heard as well, some people saying, you know, the industry has dealt with a considerable disruption due to COVID-19 and the lockdowns, and we've even seen the loss incidents falling according to the data, and there haven't been any sort of headline disruptions in the services. So the question is, you know, is there anything more to do on resilience? Isn't everything fine? So I think that definitely isn't the case, and it was very interesting that the recent virtual Op Risk Europe conference, which is the sort of premier operational risk conference in Europe, Nick Strange from the UK regulator tackled that issue head on, and he said, you know, he's hearing these comments, but that actually you need to recognize that there are a number of important characteristics of a COVID that made it much more difficult to manage than you might get from a cyber attack or whatever. And he mentioned a few things. Number one, it was a slow burner. So firms had a lot of time to prepare, and including those who are part of bigger groups, they could see what was happening in Asia and then learn the lessons from that and then apply it within the UK operations. And then the other thing that the UK regulator emphasized was, of course, that this was a systemic shock. So everyone was in the same boat. And that is very different to the kind of shocks that you may get where they are impacting only your firm or a small number of firms, and that they come with much more velocity. So you don't have the time to prepare. So the Nick Strange message, and I think it's definitely the right one, is that there is still a lot of work to do around operational resilience, and that no one should be complacent just because COVID-19 seems to have been handled reasonably well. Okay, so getting onto my slides, the first question that we tend to get asked when we do webinars and masterclasses and what have you on operational resilience is exactly, you know, what is operational resilience and how does it relate to operational risk management? Is it a subset of operational risk? is operational risk a subset of operational resilience? And what I hope to do in the next 10 to 15 minutes is just to try and shed a bit of light on this issue. But first of all, I think it's sensible to wind back a little bit. So the global financial crisis, I think we would all agree, demonstrated that there was a lack of resilience in the global financial system. Regulators first focused on financial resilience, more capital, more liquidity. And then after addressing that, they focused on operational resilience. And if you look particularly at the UK, that was a really hot topic because major UK banks seem to keep having these major IT failures. So RBS and TSB being prime examples. And obviously this attracted a great deal of attention from regulators and from our parliament as well in the UK. And ironically, on the day that the parliamentary inquiry started into IT failures and resilience in banking, HSBC had a major IT problem, just to kind of reinforce the point that there were issues around resilience. And there was a particular issue around aged legacy systems and what have you, and the lack of investment in those. So the focus has switched to operational resilience, both at a national level, but also, as Andrew has already gone through, at an international level. So we had the operational resilience working group set up at the BCBS, which has almost kind of taken over from the operational risk group in terms of driving forward the BCBS's policy on this. And of course, we had the recent publication of the operational risk principles that Andrew's already taken you through. I think initially when regulators first started talking about operational resilience, there was quite a great deal of confusion as to exactly what they were talking about. As I've already mentioned, what do you actually mean by operational resilience? And we certainly heard a lot of people in the market talking about this as being a new risk, and firms looking at adding operational resilience risk to their risk taxonomies and what have you. And I think there was a real danger at that time, which was certainly recognized by regulators, that we may repeat some of the errors that were made around conduct risk, where post-crisis, huge focus on this new thing called conduct, and a lot of firms went out there and created new conduct functions and duplicative risk assessment frameworks for conduct. So the regulators, and if we can flip back to the previous slide, the regulators came out and both at the UK level and now with the BCBS principles have made it very clear that they see operational resilience as an outcome, and that it's an outcome of effective operational risk management. And I think that really focuses very clearly that this is an outcome of effective operational risk management. And if we can flip on to the next slide, that would be great. So Andrew's already mentioned the fact that the BCBS in their principles have said that the banks should be leveraging their respective functions for the management of operational risk. And UK regulators made similar comments in their CPs. And there's also an emphasis that firms need to look at the different components of non-financial risk collectively, rather than in silos to help manage operational resilience. And it's certainly true that one of the big challenges for operational risk management, really in the last decade or so, has been that it has become so fragmented. So you've seen, and I've already mentioned conduct, but all the different fragments of operational risk have tended to kind of separate. And indeed, you've even seen, the different components almost become higher profile and more powerful within the organization than the operational risk management function. And I think this fragmentation in operational risk has in fact been a barrier to delivery of resilience, of operational resilience. Now we think that one of the best ways to deliver this kind of integrated, holistic view on operational risk to help you deliver operational resilience is the umbrella approach. And if you use some imagination, this graphic here is supposed to be an umbrella to try and capture that idea of an umbrella that the operational risk management function in the second line provides the overview across the different components of non-financial risk by providing that common language, that common risk assessment framework, and what have you, so that you can actually compare different types of non-financial risk, which is obviously essential when you're doing the reporting up to the board. We flip over to the next slide. And this slide really just tries to illustrate that, you can look at the different components of non-financial risk. You can then apply the tools of operational risk management to help with the delivery of operational resilience. And I think this also tries to emphasize, which we'll get onto much more in the next few slides, that it's not about creating things that are new. It's about, as much as possible, trying to leverage what you have already, which again is the point that the regulators, both nationally in the UK and the BCBS level, are emphasizing. This really isn't about trying to create new cottage industries for operational resilience. It's definitely something we want to avoid. Flip over to the next slide. And you'll probably recognize this from the paper that was put out recently on World Bank's Deliver Herd Immunity. We included this chart in there. And really all we're trying to show here is the different, almost the different lenses. So you have a traditional operational risk management type approach, a BCM approach, and then an operational risk approach with this resilience lens to it. So just to take the first example in terms of business services. So typically operational risk management would be focused around business processes, if it's a process mapping type approach to RCSA, or focused on key activities. BCM would tend to focus on those key IT business processes and developing RTOs, etc. Whereas for operational resilience, the regulators have been very clear that you need to look at those important business services and to get that end-to-end view. So it's really just a different lens, a different perspective, using the operational risk management framework to deliver what the regulators are looking for. If you flip over to the next slide, please. So this is, again, trying to capture where we think you can leverage on existing frameworks and tools, and where there are new things that need to be done to deliver on operational resilience and to evidence operational resilience to regulators. And this is focused because the UK is the only regulator so far who set out in detail the various steps to deliver operational resilience. We focus this around those 7 steps that are set out there. And I think the key thing, again, to emphasize here is to leverage what you have already. So for instance, and of course the BCBS emphasizes this as well in one of their principles, to leverage things like your existing governance committees. So it's not about creating new committees, it's about leveraging things you have already. It's about using existing systems. So most banks will have an existing GRC, a system that they use for operational risk to house RCSA and for their incident collection. So it's not about getting a new system for operational resilience. It's about leveraging your existing system. And I know that a lot of the system vendors are working hard to develop functionality within their systems to support operational resilience. I think one of the critical areas where firms should look to leverage what they're already doing on operational risk is around RCSA. So taking RCSA and then mapping the key risks and the controls in RCSA across, horizontally to their important business services. So one of the challenges, of course, is that most firms would do RCSA on a kind of a functional vertical basis. So again, it's a question of being able to map those vertical risks and controls across horizontally end-to-end for important business services. And again, systems will play an important role in that. It's very challenging to do in a spreadsheet. Flip over to the next And final slide. So again, this is something that we get asked very frequently at events, is who should be doing what on this? Who should be leading? And how does this relate across the 3 lines, or the 3 lines of defense? And what we've tried to do here is to show a possible view on this. Now, the UK regulator has, I guess, helpfully been quite prescriptive in terms of what they want to see. So they've said that they expect, where it exists, the SMF-24, which is the chief operations function within the first line of defense, taking the lead in terms of implementing the framework and reporting, which I think makes sense to have that ownership within the first line. But equally, I think it follows from the fact that we're saying this is about an outcome from effective operational risk management, that it really needs to be a partnership. So what we're seeing in general is that you have leadership within the first line, but then you have very close collaboration and partnership with the second line under the CRO to provide that oversight and challenge throughout the process. Where we see a more explicit role for the second line, although this is our sort of personal view, it isn't something that the regulators have necessarily taken a view on yet, is that we think that the second line probably does have more of a clear role to play around the self-assessment that is required. Not least because we think that as a general principle, people shouldn't be marking their own homework. So if the first line is taking the lead around implementation of the operational resilience framework, then it's good to have some independence in terms of that self-assessment to give greater assurance to the board and, of course, to regulators as well. And then just obviously, internal audit also has a clear role in terms of providing that independent assurance and doing the periodic reviews of operational resilience, which I imagine will become a key part of their reviews on operational risk and the operational risk management framework. Thank you very much. Over to you, David.
So thank you, Alok, Andrew, and Jimmy. I'd like to probably draw on some of the things that have been said so far, just to try and echo or re-emphasize those. Again, there's quite a lot of detail in the slides we're going through today. One of the golden rules on presentation is don't put too much detail into the slides, but we wanted to be able to provide that detail because we think without that, it's more of just like talking points, and a lot of talking has been done on operational resilience so far. So we tried to bring it to life a little bit, particularly using the UK published papers and what the UK regulators are thinking, which I'd probably describe as kind of leading practice in the industry at the moment. As Andrew has rightly said, the normal way of reading this is to read the principles first, and then you might look at the UK papers as one example of how you could achieve those principles. Just showing the BAL definition here around resilience, where they're talking around critical operations. So just wanted to emphasize here that although the UK regulator is talking about important business services, I think you can use this to some extent interchangeably. And I believe this is something that maybe Nick Strange mentioned, I think, at the conference he was speaking at. And we are hoping that when the UK regulator publishes the final papers, that it will have taken into account the BAL publications. I think the other way of looking at this, which is also, I think, still valid and achieves the same outcome, is that if you identify your important business services to your customers, like the ability to make a payment, that might be made up of a series of critical operations. And it's the mapping exercise that will allow you to make sure that you've understood all of those critical operations and that you're able to see the resources required to be able to deliver them even under stress conditions. So that is just something I wanted to kind of mention up front here. If we could just go to the next slide, please. So again, just a bit of background. COVID-19, together with the fact that regulators were already beginning to focus more on operation resilience, is shifting the landscape to some extent. So boards are now much more involved, I think. They want to know what's going on. They've obviously been involved in the crisis management, which has been ongoing, the business continuity aspects, all of which are critical to being able to deliver these services. Largely, I think people, even subconsciously, with this as IT related, but certainly COVID has shed light on other important aspects about how the resources required, especially around people and facilities. And also rapid strides have been made, particularly remote working. So the fact that we are doing this, people are working routinely from home or remotely now, it really was almost unthinkable a year ago. And I think one of the important things here, because again, money is going to be tight, budget is going to be very tight. So in committing to spend on this, which is quite possibly required from a regulatory perspective, turning this into a competitive advantage and actually getting value for money, because regulatory compliance is expensive, is really important. And that does then come back to some of the things I think Jimi and others have been saying around using what you've got, being sensible, don't panic. I think that there is time on this, and designing that framework is really, really important. So if we could shift to the next slide, please. And again, some of these lessons learned have already been mentioned. So one of the key points here, and I think this is where BAL was hugely helpful, is explaining that we should leverage the existing operational risk management framework. That really wasn't something that the UK regulator had made clear in writing or in their consultation papers, although in conversation, they are kind of saying that was what was meant. But now BAL has come out and said that, which is really important. Getting senior management and staff buy-in, I think, is probably fairly easy at the moment. Everybody can see what's been happening, but also not getting into too much detail. It's very easy to dive into all the detail and all the different building blocks, but stepping back, making sure what you are designing and looking to implement is fit for purpose and proportionate for your organization and for the profile of your organization. And particularly important, and I can't really say this enough, is leveraging what you've already got. If you're looking at things like cybersecurity around business continuity, you very well are likely to have already good plans in place. You don't need to reinvent those. And again, that is also where it's good saying use, I guess, what you've got. And also MI, so the board is wanting to know what's going on. So already there's a lot of information out there. And where there are gaps, quite often, I think you can fill those gaps quite quickly using expert judgment from SMEs. Well, how is it going? But then maybe it takes a bit of time to get the indicators or being able to automate that to some extent so that you can really see where you are. So if we can go to the next slide, please. On board expectation, I've mentioned, but really the board now needs to be able to demonstrate that they're in control. I think that is important. And also setting that against your appetites and your tolerances and your risk appetite. Again, something that the BAL has come out and said explicitly, which is really important. If you're not linking it to your risk appetite, your risk capacity, and you can have hours of debate on what risk appetite and capacity means, but without getting into that almost philosophical side of things, if you're not linking your ability to provide your important business services within certain timeframes, then you've got a division between the two. It's really important that this is all joined up. So on the next slide is just a reminder of what a framework, the steps to create the framework could look like, that I think is consistent with the BAL paper. And this is taken from the UK regulators' papers, which have a lot of really helpful detail on how you could do things in there, how you could consider things, which I think is a great starting point to then consider actually how do you want to do it for your organization. So I won't go through all of those, But I guess item 1 about the framework, who does what, the policy and process, the governance, which has been touched on, I think by everybody so far, is really important, as it is with any other form of business activity. And I guess I'll just want to talk a little bit more about the next items, identifying important business services or critical operations. So again, if we could use these interchangeably, but should achieve the same outcome. So this is the starting point. And in doing this, everything that flows from this, the mapping, the identifying of resources, is almost has a multiplying effect on the amount of information that you need, or the amount of work that you need to do and maintain. Because let's also remember, if you do this fantastic exercise up front and very detailed work, let's say maybe too detailed, then you have to maintain that, and that actually comes with that overhead as well. So that is one of the key starting points in how we would do that. And the bottom bullet point is, again, is just a reminder of why we are doing this mapping exercise, is so you can identify where you might have a vulnerability in being able to deliver it. Because again, the world is very complex now. The interactions between people, premises, third parties, information required, for instance, to make a payment, the IT. If any one of those bits of the jigsaw fail, then the whole service will not be delivered to the customer. So if we can go on to the next slide, thank you. So just taking a slight step back to try and think, well, what could these business services look like? This slide is publicly available. It was published by the Investment Association on an article on operational resilience at the end of last year. And what they did, they sat down as a body and thought of a fictional asset management firm, which may be directly applicable to some of you, but I think even in our personal lives, hopefully some of my pension is still surviving through the crisis, but I think we all have made personal investments at some times. We have money that's managed by people. We want to be able to pay that money in, or we want to be able to draw down on it, for instance. So they looked at what they saw with a basic cycle from investments, payments out, valuation in, etc., through that cycle. If we could then go to the next slide, they then came up with essentially 7, as they saw it, important business services at a high level. So one of the great questions is, well, how many important business services would you expect someone to have? My view is it should be in the 10s, not in the 100s. And it should be something that actually makes sense to your board and to everybody. You might then have multiple ways in which you deliver that service, and that can be where the complexity comes in. And maybe through all this, one of the plus points could be to actually remove some of that complexity, standardize how processes run, and then potentially digitize. So through resilience, there is the possibility to increase efficiency, reduce cost, etc. But the list there, you can see it. So they essentially came up with these. So investments, so trade execution. So people, once they give you their money, you need to be able to do something with it. Payments out, physical payment. They want their money back. So again, won't go through all of these, but I think intrinsically these kind of make sense. And I would say this is potentially the kind of level that we should be looking at. If we could just go to the next slide, please. And again, this is just possible steps. So how will you actually identify it yourselves? So first one is look at the potentials. I think if you've got some SMEs, you've got 2 or 3 of the right people in the room, you could come up with a short list of potential important business services. Then you need a criteria, a scoring mechanism to decide what those might be. They can be impact on the customer, they could be on the health of the firm, or the systemic impact if this service was no longer applicable. From that, you agree, you sign off your important business services, and then you look at your tolerances. So setting tolerances, which is from the customer's perspective about how long can they do without those services. And that's independent of the mapping exercise. So you set the tolerances before you begin the mapping, or in parallel to do that. And then mapping here means I've been able to identify your resources. And I'll just try and show an example of what those resources might look like in a minute. We're then getting into stress scenarios and also obviously lessons learned from COVID. Other incidents, maybe where the data center has gone down, what has actually happened. And if you think you're going to be outside of tolerance, then you need to agree some actions to get back within tolerance. And again, one of the whole things around this is that we have to recognize that on occasions, things will go wrong. In the past, the board didn't really want to hear, I think on occasions, the fact that you could go outside your appetite, your tolerance, that things could go wrong. This allows us to actually change and shift and actually have that discussion. So yes, if we could just go to the next slide, please. So if we just think about a customer payment, this is very simplistic. You've got four main steps here. So the payment request is sent by the customer. It's checked internally for authenticity, completeness. Then we all have to go through AML, sanction screening these days. Then the request is executed and transmitted to the customer, and then the payment has to receive the customer. So down the left-hand side at the bottom, we've got people, process, technology, facilities, information, third parties, broad umbrellas. But then within that, just try to show, well, what might that mean? So under people, potential teams, you might need customer service. You might need compliance activity. You might need anti-fraud. And then you need the payments teams to actually make the payments. Within that, you've got multiple processes, the payment application. So that can be received potentially in multiple ways. It could be via telephone. It could be by an online banking platform, etc. So again, not going to go through all of these, but hopefully you can see how without too much effort, you can begin to build up a picture, because I think it's very easy to almost be daunted at the outset thinking this is a huge task. But I think a lot about building resilience and being able to demonstrate that you have resilience is really just to step back, see what you've got, and then kind of calmly put the pieces of the jigsaw together as they are appropriate to you. So the next slide, and I think this is the final slide before we move on to the panel discussion. So at this point, I will also say, if you've got any questions, please, I think through the software, you're able to ask those questions that we are looking forward to trying to answer. So in practice, what could this look like? So it's kind of start with a pilot, almost look at where you are. You could potentially look, I think, against the BAL principles and what that means to you. You could look in a bit more detail against the UK regulations and where are you against what they're expecting. Then from that and through the pilot, you can then design your framework, what that could look like. And pilots, I think, are hugely powerful. You learn a lot from pilots, and also you get real key buy-in from the SMEs, the people who actually need to deliver this in the first line. And once you've got that, then yes, it will take time to roll out, and the training, the testing, the self-assessment is also very important. And as Jimi's mentioned, the roles of the first line and second line and third line in all of this, to make sure that although the first line are likely to be driving this in practice because they know the business and the risks, the second line are there for challenge and oversight. So at that point, I will stop, hopefully within time, and hopefully I'll hand back to you, Alok.
So thanks, David, Andrew, Jimi, for taking us through more from the industry perspective, interpretation, and the key questions. Very quickly, just to summarize, some of you who are new to this webinar and not attended the earlier one, we have summarized the earlier webinar in form of a white paper, which is available on the website, or you can request us. We'll be happy to share that. Titled as Will Banks Develop Herd Immunity? So you can access that, and we have detailed out a lot of conceptual issues in terms of how do you build an operational resilience framework. What are the questions, key questions you need to answer? Moving on from there, specifically from a local or regional perspective, we have been speaking to banks almost on daily basis. And in the previous webinar, we ran a survey, a poll, and the results were very interesting. And this is also outlined in the white paper. But the results, it is a participation by close to 40 institutions who were part of the earlier webinar. And what it clearly demonstrate, where the industry is today. So if you look, the percentage of banks who are just started or beginning to consider operational resilience as a key priority. So they're close to 30% of respondents who are in that category. Very small percentage, less than about 5% who say that they have not considered it at all so far. And obviously this is before the BCBS guidance notes came. And as all of us know, once the final guidance is published, then that gets translated into the local regulatory guidance note by the local supervisors. So I think the subject has obviously picked up more prominence. Very interestingly, roughly about 45% believe they're partially resilient. Obviously, we have not defined what partially means here. So whether partially means 10% or 50%, but that's what a large percentage of respondents believed. And interestingly, 15% believe that they are already mostly resilient. So which is very interesting outcome. And another 5% think they're fully resilient. So they close to 20% believe that they don't need to do much, and what they've got is good enough for them to survive once in a century crisis like what we have gone through, or I would say still going through. So the idea is here, just to set a context, and obviously there is no regulatory guidance available from the local regulators. There are bits and pieces which have come out from different regulators in the regions or from central banks, where some central banks have given some follow-up, guidance on cyber risk, or some have given specifically on digital risk or things like that. So I think the general direction is that post BCBS, obviously, there will be a series of local guidance available for the banks. Have the banks started looking into this as a specific priority for next year and creating budgets around it? Yes, answer is certainly yes, because as mentioned by all of you, and most of our client conversation, that board has become extremely concerned about the resilience as a key capability for the organizations, and the experience has been very diverse when we talk to the client. So I'll give you some very interesting examples, like Andrew made a comment that bank who were more resilient have fared better. So when the switch to work from home happened in the first week of COVID back in March, there were banks who had already some kind of work from home, bring your own device kind of policies, and there were banks which had no policy at all from the remote working point of view. So that touches on the governance aspect. Interestingly, on the resources, when we map, many banks actually couldn't just procure the laptops. So when they moved to work from home and they went out to procure the laptops, the laptops were on short supply in the market, and they just couldn't mobilize the resources. So very simple, commonsensical examples of getting the broadband at the employee's place and getting the laptops. And there were behavioral aspects around, a lot of functions. The employee were used to look at two screens, and now, bigger screens and two screens, and now they're working on single screen, smaller screens. So range of experiences banks had in terms of how to mobilize resources. Also, what was interesting in terms of the overall definition around critical operations or business services, I would say banks were lucky because a lot of that and that's what our client and banks tell us, a lot of that came from the national regulators. So they set up the priority in terms of what needs to be up and running, whether you need your ATM full of cash, or you need to operate some of your branches, or you need to facilitate some specific types of transaction, which has wider financial market implications. So a lot of that guidance came from the regulators. So banks, in a way, we're just executing a lot of those guidance given by the national supervisors. So these are the, in a very nutshell, the local experiences and the local status where banks are sitting today. What I would like to also do, pick up the questions. We've got so far about 6 questions, and I'll like to put it up for the panel. The first question we have is for Jimi, that you made a mention, in terms of the first line and second line. So the question is that, are you suggesting that RCSA will be done by independent unit from the actual units?
No, so I don't think you would change who does the RCSA. I think RCSA would still be done by the people who own the risks, which of course could include the second line and the third line, who should be doing their own RCSAs, but predominantly would be people who own the risks in the first line.
Right. Okay. And then I think the next question is also, Jimi, for you, is that question is, I'm finding that CRO and second line are being tasked and finding it hard to get first line to take control. Any suggestions around that?
I think that is a challenge. I think one of the things we're seeing is that in some firms, this is very much being led by the second line, by the operational risk function, with the plan at some point to pass it over to the first line to take the lead. I only appreciate that could be challenging in some organizations. I think the way you get around that, or you resolve that issue, is through using the operational risk management framework. So if you're actually using the tools of operational risk management, including RCSA, etc., then obviously it's the first line who are owning that, or they should be at least. So you will naturally enable you to pass on the actual implementation and operation of operational resilience delivery into the first line, with the second line then taking very much that oversight role and owning the framework.
Can I just say something as well? Yeah. Charles, I feel your pain. It wasn't operational resilience, but I was rolling out an operational risk framework in a very large organization. And we continually came up against this issue. And one of the things that we found quite beneficial was the use of swim lanes, so that you could make it quite clear when you're handing over responsibility. So in Jimi's example of risk and control self-assessment, when is that a first line activity? What exactly does that involve? When does it move across to the second line? Because the first line's role in operational resilience is that they should implement the operational risk policy that has been written by the second line, and they should also be responsible for reporting. So, you know, at some stage, or my experience when I was working with this organization was obviously at some stage we had to get the policy formally approved by the board risk committee. And we had within that policy this swim lane approach. And so once that was formally approved, then there was that reduced scope for the first line, and in fact the second line and third lines, to be uncertain about where their roles and responsibilities lay. So that may be something, a technique that's worth looking at. Thanks,
Okay.
Alok.
Yeah, thanks. David, for you, doesn't a good BCM ensures operational resilience?
It's certainly a very big step towards it. I think business continuity management tends in most institutions to operate in silos, in so much you will look at your IT infrastructure and you will have a test on, can you recover your IT? You might have a test on people or premises. So your main office goes down, you go to your backup office. I think rarely does anybody at the moment do kind of the end-to-end test, which would provide the customer with the full service. So if you take a payment request as an example again, from the institution receive a payment request to the bank, or it doesn't necessarily have to be a bank, but from the institution actually releasing the money and it actually being received by the customer, that has a whole host of things which you probably test separately under business continuity at the moment. So it doesn't mean you've got to completely redo your business continuity. I think it's just knowing what all the steps are and then making sure that all those steps would join up in a real scenario.
One of the fascinating things about this, David, and I agree totally with what you're saying. And if we take the pandemic out of the equation and we look at, you know, in the UK, we had the TSB outage, we had the NatWest Ulster Bank outage, you know, in their early stages, these would have been viewed as business continuity events. It's just at some stage they transition and become resilience events because I think because they're threatening the safety and soundness of the firm or the financial system. So, so business continuity, I agree with you. Business continuity is crucial, and I think it's the foundation because it's what happens initially. What's the first thing that we do? If we've got a cyber attack or an IT outage, we're going to initiate our business continuity management plan. But the key is that at some stage, and it may have to do with impact tolerances, how long can we be without the system for, these things morph into resilience events. And I asked this question I was doing some training and I asked the question, was the distinction between business continuity and operational resilience helpful? And actually everybody that was on the course felt that it was a useful distinction, but that we shouldn't worry too much about when, you know, where's the border between the two. So I agree with you. I think it's got a real relationship, and at some stage, most things start as business continuity, but at some stage, you know, when they start to have the potential impact on the organization, then they become resilient. So resilience is more than business continuity.
I think as well, it's having that look through from your business continuity management to focus on those important business services, and always having that focus on what is the plan B or the plan C. So maybe, you know, you can recover a key system within 12 hours, but is that acceptable from an impact tolerance perspective in terms of, for instance, harm to your consumers? Do you need to be looking for a plan B that enables you to continue providing that important service until your system can be back up? I think the other dimension as well to it, I really like the Lyndon Nelson's acronym. So he talked about, he wanted firms to be on a war footing, and he talked about withstand, absorb, and recover. Obviously, BCM focuses on the recover, but also we shouldn't forget that operational resilience is also looking at the ability to withstand and absorb, which I think is where you really get into the heart of this being about good operational risk management, which is also on the preventative.
And I think Jimi, Andrew, David, also PRA also mentions that, in the context of resilience, you have to assume the risk has crystallized. So, in a way, you have already run out of your, runway on the BCM arena, and now you are getting into somewhat more longer duration and severe impact scenario where a plan B may become more relevant. So now, Andrew, interesting questions for you is that, um, you know, unlike BC and BCBS sometimes have been blamed for nail and hammer approach, and obviously nail is risk and hammer is capital, but surprisingly in the context of the new guidance, it's remarkably silent on the measurement or the capital aspects progressively on the operational resilience front. So the question from the participant is around, do you think that resilience may become a pillar to component in foreseeable future from a capital perspective?
So let's just step back a bit for those who need this. So there's a couple of elements to the pillar 2, and one is the ICAP, and it's a firm's assessment of the amount of capital that they need. The regulator then does an assessment. And by way of a spoiler, I should say up front, I hope that operational resilience doesn't become a distinct requirement for capital under the pillar 2. But let me explain why I think that's the case. So in pillar 2, what you're doing is you are setting aside capital, and this is capital for events that weren't covered in the pillar 1 space. And so, and don't forget that when we think of operational resilience, we're thinking of something that's in the impact space. So operational resilience, as it stands in its own right, is not an event. You might get an IT outage, that's the event. You might get a cyber attack, that's the event. You might get a pandemic, that's the event. The resilience piece is in the impact. So I'd be very uncomfortable if the regulators turned around and said, we want you to put money aside for operational resilience. What I can see happening is that, and again, let's think of 2 types of operational resilience. Let's think about what I call business as usual operational resilience, and that is cyber, IT outage, those sorts of things. You should already have those in your ICAP assessment, or in fact in your pillar 1 assessment if you're modeling your pillar 1, and I know that's something that's going away. So those sorts of events that can lead to operational resilience incidents, you should already have. You might want to revisit some of those based on lessons learned, and say, what we've seen is that this impact might be greater. So you should already be covering those. I think we need to think about the pandemic slightly differently. And so the question for firms on the pandemic is, do you, when you're doing your ICAP or doing your pillar 1 assessment, do you have a pandemic scenario in there? And so firms that have a pandemic scenario as part of their pillar 2, and lots of firms told me that they did, firms that had a pandemic scenario have already covered resilience in the pandemic, in the current situation. Again, they would need to revisit it, because I think the sorts of pandemic that we're seeing now was never envisaged by firms when they were producing their ICAPs. Nobody envisaged people working from home for months on end. So firms with a pandemic scenario need to revisit that. They need to rethink whether they've correctly assessed the impact. And if as a firm you don't have a pandemic scenario, then I think the regulator will expect you to have a pandemic scenario. And I think the key thing for firms when they're producing their ICAPs, because this will be a hot topic and it will be something that regulators are looking for, would be to specifically call out how they have treated operational resilience in producing their ICAP, explaining that operational resilience is in the impact space. And so you have covered the events that might lead to an operational resilience event, but you haven't got a specific operational resilience scenario, because that's not appropriate with the way that things are done. But you certainly need to enable the regulator. This might sound rather cynical, but lots of regulators are going to get the ICAPs, and the first thing they're going to look at is, how have you treated the pandemic? So I think you need a pandemic scenario which captures the impacts if you haven't got one already. Lots of firms have got them already. You would want to revisit that to update the impacts. But I would be very concerned if a regulator turned around and said, we want a specific amount of capital set aside for operational resilience, because what you're going to have is double counting. You're going to already have set capital aside for pandemics. You're already going to have set capital aside for cyber attacks and IT outages. Okay. I don't know if anyone else has got any thoughts.
Yes, so I think that's one of the question, because and there's a related question, in somewhat related question which just popped up is, are there any ways to measure how resilient organizations are? So is there a magic?
Shall I try and address that one, and then others can chip in, because it's a brilliant question. You could be slightly cynical, say, and look at the end results where firms have had issues and see if they're still standing. Is certainly one way, but that isn't the way you want to test it. I think that at the moment it's maybe an assessment, which is similar to a measurement, but maybe slightly less empirical. I think if you could take a profile of an organization, and then you can map the various things we've been talking about today. So have they defined, let's say, critical operations or important business services? Have they identified the resources to deliver those? Is the governance structure in place? I think you can put a clear, I will say, scoring mechanism around those that will show, I think, how mature you are against that. You could potentially do that on levels of maturity of saying you're 25% of the way there, 50%, 75%, you're there. Or maybe you're at leading practice, which is beyond 100%, beyond regulatory expectation, because you think that's good for you. So I think that there are ways to do it. I think you could do a relatively quick assessment with some SMEs or the appropriate people. So yeah, I think that can definitely be done.
I think ultimately this is the whole approach of the regulators to require firms to evidence how resilient they are. And obviously the scenario analysis is a key part of that. So to develop your severe but plausible scenarios and seeing whether you could remain resilient within those. And if you have scenarios where you couldn't continue to provide that important business service because you need to, address vulnerabilities in key systems and what have you, that you're actually addressing those with the end result that you're becoming more resilient. I think that's where the regulators are coming from. It's identifying your current level of resilience, looking at where there are gaps in that, and then addressing them through actions.
What does worry me is that firms look at their experience in this year and say, because we have survived the pandemic and the organization still grows, therefore we are resilient. But I think it's important, and Jimi's already mentioned these, to understand that there are a couple of things that are quite distinct about the pandemic. One is, certainly for European organizations, it was a relatively slow burn. At a time in January and February when Asian countries were stepping up their protocols against the virus, nothing was really happening in Europe at that stage. And so it was quite a slow burn. So firms could look at what was happening abroad. They could look at the SARS experience. So there was lots of time to prepare, and everybody's in the same boat. So if I ring my bank and the customer service is poor, I know that if I rang another bank, their customer service would also be impacted. But a traditional resilience event is something that just happens to you as an organization. So, you know, when a customer rings your customer helpline and he can't get a response, he knows that if he banked with a competitor, he would be getting a response. So, you know, I agree with David, you know, there's a lot can be done around benchmarking, looking at what you're doing, looking at the lessons you learned, but please, whatever you do, don't assume that because you have managed to survive the pandemic, you would survive an individual resilience event that hit your organization. I think that assumption is a step too far.
And I think in the UK, sorry, after you, Alok.
Yeah, and that's an important point. And, you know, the Fed, the author Lindo, who's also chairing the Resilience Committee and represents Federal Reserve, made an important comment that from the macroprudential perspective, they also need to look at the substitutability, in the sense they would have to assume that some firms will not be resilient and they may stop functioning in a, you know, extreme event. So that also, you know, is an important dimension. I think Jimi mentioned it, and you mentioned very early on that when you are doing the assessment, you also have to clearly outline, I mean, where, you know, you will start to break. So it's a, you know, distinction between bend and break. So where you will start breaking in is also equally important in the context. Yeah, David, you were adding some.
I was only going to say that I guess in the UK, the regulators are wanting to make the board responsible for this, which is why there needs to be this annual self-assessment of how resilient you are. So from that point of view, yes, you need to develop a methodology to be able to assess that.
I think I'd add as well, just on the point that Arthur Lindau was making about the substitutability. I think that will become a key issue in the UK as well, and in other countries. So if you have a firm that is providing a service which is not going to be cost effective to provide it in a resilient way, then, you know, the obvious choice then is to withdraw that service. You stop providing it. You know, is that going to impact vulnerable customers? Will your consumers who are living in a village that has only one ATM no longer be able to access their cash? So these are going to be really difficult issues for boards and for regulators in terms of how they balance resilience on the one hand and then accessibility to services on the other.
Okay. So I think we can take maybe one more questions, and then probably that will bring us closer to the time we have allocated for today's session. And the last question again is more around the you know, the overall function and governance aspect. So, you know, as all of you mentioned that it's the best practices are still emerging. Obviously, there is a clear message that you don't need to create a separate silo. But in your experience, you know, are there a general consensus where they should house this function, whether it's house next to the BCM or part of OR, or so any such insights would be very useful as banks start to looking at it.
Well, maybe if I start and then others can add. I mean, I think what we're seeing at the moment, which probably reflects the fact that this is relatively new, is that there are a range of practices. So we see within some organizations, it's very much with the second line, who are taking the lead. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, they're taking the lead, they're building the framework, and then the plan is to hand that over to the first line. We're also seeing some organizations where, you know, it's very much the first line who are taking the lead. I think particularly where they do have the, in the UK, the SMF 24 function, where the regulators have been quite prescriptive that they expect them to be taking the lead, at least on implementation. I think what we're seeing in the more mature firms, and remember that in the UK at least, the UK regulators have been talking to the bigger firms for 4 or 5 years. You know, this 2015, 2016, they started talking with the banks on development of their operational resilience frameworks. I think what you're seeing in the more mature firms is that it is very much more of a partnership, and you'll see the announcements about you know, the larger banks hiring heads of operational resilience in the first line to work within the operations function supporting the chief operation office, but equally hiring people in the second line, so operational resilience risk stewards or whatever they're called, who sit within that operational risk umbrella within the second line, who can then provide that oversight and challenge down into the first line. I think thankfully what we're not seeing, or certainly I haven't seen, is an organization where operational resilience is being set up as a separate function and developing a separate assessment framework and what have you. In other words, repeating some of the mistakes that were made around the conduct risk, which I think is good, and it shows that the regulators have got their message out that this isn't a new risk, and you don't need to create a new framework to assess and manage it.
Okay. So Andrew, quickly, maybe a last one interesting from Mike. So is it about known unknown or unknown unknown?
Yeah, this is a great question from Mike, and he's talking about how you measure resilience to withstand true unforeseeable events, and he makes the point, and I agree with him totally, was that you could see the pandemic happening. We produced a paper discussing whether it was a true black swan. We decided that it wasn't. It's actually the term, let's not get into semantics, but is grey rhino. I think the point is, Mike, that there must be an event out there that we can't foresee and we can't envisage, but the expectation would be that a firm's resilience response and resilience framework was sufficiently robust to be able to deal with that event. Now, if we look, and I've just warned against people using the pandemic to say that everything's okay, but as a result of the pandemic, we now have in our resilience response a number of actions that we didn't have before. You know, we've never had people working from home, for example, you know, and dealers and those sorts of people working from home. So your point about what about a totally unique unknown experience is perfectly valid, but the expectation would be that your resilience framework was sufficient in order for you to be able to deal with that. And a lot of the things that are in a resilience framework, so let's say it's your communication element, your lessons learned element, your governance framework, a lot of those would be the same irrespective of the actual event. So I think the key to being able to protect against these unforeseeable events which you identify is to have a robust, and I use the term, although I hate it, but to have a very strong operational resilience framework which can operate irrespective of the specific event that you're talking about. I think that's the solution.
All right, so I think that brings us to the close of this session. Again, there's a question from Mohammed, which is more relating to some other aspects of Basel too. So Mohammed, my colleague, will get in touch with you on one-to-one and provide the clarification. So thank you, gentlemen, again for being part of this very interesting webinar. As we mentioned earlier, we continue to contribute back and share the knowledge with the industry. So we will be scheduling a follow-up event going into, again, the key challenges in rolling this out. So we will keep you informed about our next webinar, and the summary of this webinar again will be published by us similar to the last time in form of a white paper, and the recordings will be shared with and the copy of presentation will be shared with all the participants. So thank you very much for your participation. Thank you, Andrew, Jimmy, David. It's always great to hear you guys, and you bring so much practical insights on these complex subjects. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Alok, and thanks
Alok.
everybody for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.